The night my family laughed around the table, warm and unguarded, I remember thinking how rare it was to belong to something that felt so effortless. I didn't know then that calm can be mistaken for permission, or that love, when uninterrupted, can quietly assign roles no one ever votes on. My name is Amina, and for most of my life I believed harmony was something you maintained the way you maintain a house, by fixing small things before they became visible and by never letting discomfort linger long enough to be named. That belief shaped me early, so early that I cannot remember a version of myself that did not listen more than speak or adjust before anyone asked, and if you had met us then, if you had stepped into our living room on any given evening, you would have seen a family that moved with the practiced ease of people who knew each other well and loved without ceremony. My mother's voice filled spaces gently, my father's presence anchored the room without demanding attention, my siblings moved in and out of conversations like people who trusted that someone else would catch whatever fell, and I was there in the middle of it all, steady, aware, content to observe and contribute in equal measure. There was nothing secretive about our closeness, nothing strained or forced, and the rituals of our days unfolded with such predictability that I found comfort in them rather than boredom, from the way my father cleared his throat before offering an opinion to the way my mother insisted on setting the table properly even when it was only the 5 of us eating together, and the way my siblings argued without anger and resolved without drama, all of it creating an atmosphere that felt stable, enough to last forever. I learned early that being useful was not a burden but a way of belonging, and I took pride in remembering birthdays, in coordinating schedules, in making sure no one felt overlooked during gatherings, because these were the invisible threads that held us together, and I believed that tending to them was an act of care rather than obligation. When people described me, they used words that sounded like compliments: dependable, composed, easy to be around, and I accepted them without questioning what they implied, because I liked the version of myself that those words reflected, the one who could be relied upon without complaint, the one who could listen without interrupting, the one who could absorb the emotional temperature of a room and adjust herself accordingly. And if there were moments when I felt tired or slightly displaced, I dismissed them as normal fluctuations rather than signs of anything deeper, because everyone feels tired sometimes, and everyone makes compromises for family. Our home was not large, but it was orderly in a way that reflected my mother's sensibilities, every surface purposeful, every object placed with intention, and I often found myself straightening a cushion or aligning a stack of papers without realizing I was doing it, because order felt like a language we all spoke fluently. Conversations flowed easily there, and silence was never uncomfortable, only companionable, and I remember thinking more than once that this was what people meant when they talked about being lucky with the family they were born into, because nothing about us felt volatile or unpredictable, and even disagreements resolved themselves through patience rather than confrontation. I was the middle child, though that fact never felt particularly significant at the time, because no one treated me as though I were overlooked or overshadowed, and if anything, I felt uniquely positioned to understand everyone at once, close enough to my older sibling to admire without resentment, close enough to my younger one to guide without authority, and perhaps that is where my instinct to mediate took root, because I learned to translate perspectives before I learned to assert my own. When my older sibling spoke about work frustrations, I listened carefully and offered thoughtful responses, and when my younger sibling worried about decisions that felt too big for their age, I reassured them without dismissing their concerns, and these exchanges felt natural, even rewarding, because being trusted is a powerful thing, especially within a family. There were evenings when we sat together after dinner, each of us absorbed in our own quiet activity, my father reading, my mother sorting through household papers, my siblings scrolling through their phones or discussing plans, and I would feel a sense of contentment settle over me, the kind that doesn't demand expression because it is complete in itself. I didn't crave attention in those moments, nor did I feel invisible, because I knew that if I spoke, someone would listen, and that knowledge alone seemed sufficient, and perhaps it was this assurance that made me comfortable with stepping back, because I trusted that my presence was understood even when it wasn't foregrounded. If there was a pattern to my contributions, it was subtle enough to pass as coincidence, and I didn't keep score because there was nothing to measure against, no sense of imbalance that demanded correction. When plans needed coordination, I offered to handle it. When emotions ran high, I stayed calm. When decisions stalled, I summarized options clearly, and no one ever asked me to do these things explicitly, which made them feel less like tasks and more like extensions of who I was. I didn't feel taken for granted because gratitude was always expressed, often warmly, and I believed that appreciation was proof enough that everything was as it should be. My parents trusted my judgment, a fact that filled me with quiet pride rather than pressure, and when they asked for my opinion, I gave it thoughtfully, aware that it carried weight, though I never mistook that weight for authority, because I understood my role as advisory rather than directive. I liked being consulted, liked knowing that my perspective mattered, and I didn't notice how often my suggestions aligned with what made things easier rather than what I wanted, because the two had not yet diverged in any way that felt significant. Outside our family, my life appeared equally balanced, a job that challenged me without consuming me, friendships that felt steady and unforced, routines that provided structure without rigidity, and when I described my family to others, I did so with genuine affection, aware that not everyone grew up with such consistency. And I felt a quiet responsibility to honor what I had been given by contributing to it rather than questioning it. That sense of responsibility was never framed as sacrifice in my mind, because sacrifice implies loss, and at that point, I didn't believe I was losing anything at all. There were moments, fleeting and easily dismissed, when I noticed how naturally people leaned on me, how assumptions formed around my availability, my flexibility, my willingness to adapt. But these observations passed through me without settling, because they did not yet carry emotional weight, and I was more inclined to interpret them as signs of trust rather than dependency. It felt good to be needed in ways that did not involve urgency or drama, to be the person others felt comfortable relying on, and I believed that this role suited me because it aligned with my temperament rather than constraining it. Family gatherings extended beyond our immediate household, and in those broader circles, the same dynamics played out, relatives commenting on how grounded I seemed, how mature, how composed, and I accepted these descriptions as truths rather than expectations, because no one suggested that I should be anything else, and I did not yet feel the strain of maintaining a particular image. I moved through these spaces with ease, contributing where appropriate, stepping back when others took center stage, and it all felt like a natural rhythm rather than a performance. Looking back now, I can see how thoroughly normal everything appeared, how convincingly functional our family was, and how little there was to question on the surface, because love does not announce itself loudly, and imbalance does not always arrive with warning signs. At the time, I felt secure, valued, and grounded, convinced that calm was a virtue that kept relationships intact, and I wore it the way one wears a well-fitted coat, without noticing how often others leaned against it to shield themselves from discomfort. If you had asked me then whether I was happy, I would have said yes without hesitation, because happiness, as I understood it, was not a constant thrill but a steady absence of conflict, a sense that things were working as they should, and within my family, everything seemed to function smoothly, predictably, lovingly. I believed that this stability was something to protect, something earned through patience and consideration, and I did not yet understand that stability, when built quietly on one person's adaptability, can feel solid until the moment that adaptability pauses, even briefly, to breathe. That pause had not yet come, and in those days, my calm felt like strength rather than strategy, my role felt chosen rather than assigned, and my family felt like the safest place I knew, a place where love was expressed through consistency and care rather than grand gestures, and I moved within it with confidence, unaware that even the most peaceful arrangements can carry unspoken expectations, waiting patiently for the moment when someone stops fulfilling them. The changes did not arrive as disruptions, which is why I accepted them without resistance, because nothing felt imposed and nothing felt urgent, and if there is one thing calm people trust too easily, it is gradualness. Life continued to move forward in ways that felt expected, and my place within it shifted so subtly that I mistook adjustment for growth, telling myself that this was simply what adulthood looked like when lived responsibly and with care for others. It began with practicalities, small accommodations that made sense in the moment and required no explanation, like taking over certain arrangements because my schedule was more flexible, or stepping in when someone else felt overwhelmed, or being asked to follow up on something because I was better at handling details. A phrase delivered lightly, almost affectionately, and received by me as recognition rather than redirection. I noticed that my phone rang more often with questions that were framed as requests but carried an unspoken certainty that I would say yes, and I did say yes, not because I felt cornered but because it seemed easier than introducing hesitation into situations that did not appear to warrant it. My parents leaned on me in ways that felt natural given my temperament, asking for my input on decisions that affected the household, sharing concerns that they did not voice elsewhere, trusting me to understand nuances without needing lengthy explanations, and I felt honored by this closeness, believing it reflected emotional maturity rather than imbalance. When my mother spoke to me about worries she did not share with my siblings, I interpreted it as intimacy, and when my father asked me to mediate conversations that felt delicate, I viewed it as respect, and nowhere in these interactions did I sense manipulation or expectation, only reliance that seemed justified by history. My siblings' lives expanded in visible ways, new responsibilities, new ambitions, new social circles that pulled them outward, and I found myself becoming a steady point of reference as their schedules grew unpredictable. The one who could be counted on to remember shared commitments and maintain continuity, and this did not feel burdensome because it aligned with how I saw myself, as someone who valued consistency and presence over novelty. When they vented, I listened without judgment. When they needed reassurance, I offered it calmly, and when they were unavailable, I filled in the gaps without comment, believing that family life naturally required flexibility from those best equipped to provide it. There were moments when I noticed that my own plans began to bend more frequently than before, invitations declined because something else needed attention, opportunities postponed because timing felt inconvenient for others, but these choices did not register as losses at the time because they were framed internally as temporary adjustments rather than permanent patterns. I told myself that there would be space for everything eventually, that accommodating others now did not mean erasing myself later, and this belief allowed me to move forward without resentment, convinced that balance would reassert itself naturally. The language around me shifted in ways that felt subtle enough to escape scrutiny, praise emphasizing how easy I was, how adaptable, how reassuring my presence felt, and I absorbed these descriptions without questioning their implications. Because ease is often mistaken for freedom, and adaptability is rarely interrogated when it benefits more than one person. I noticed how often conversations ended with a sense of relief once I weighed in, how tensions dissipated when I spoke, and I mistook this for emotional intelligence rather than emotional labor, because I had not yet considered that calming others could come at a cost to oneself. Family gatherings grew more complex as lives diverged, logistics requiring coordination that seemed to fall naturally into my hands, and I found myself managing schedules, mediating expectations, and ensuring that no one felt neglected, all without formal acknowledgement because the work itself was invisible when done well. I did not ask for recognition because I did not perceive what I was doing as work, and the absence of friction reinforced my belief that everything was functioning as intended, that my role was simply evolving alongside the family's needs. There were conversations that lingered with me longer than others, comments delivered casually that revealed assumptions I had not consciously agreed to, like references to my availability as a constant, or jokes about how I never minded adjusting plans, or remarks suggesting that I was the logical choice for certain responsibilities because I handled things better, and while none of these statements were unkind, they carried a quiet finality that I did not yet challenge. I smiled, nodded, and continued on, because challenging them would have required reframing dynamics that still felt benign, and I was not prepared to see them differently. My inner life remained rich and active, but it began to orient itself around anticipation rather than intention, thinking ahead to what others might need, what might arise, how best to maintain equilibrium, and this mental posture felt proactive rather than reactive, because I believed foresight was a strength. I did not yet recognize how rarely I asked myself what I needed in the same deliberate way, because the absence of crisis allowed me to believe that my needs were being met simply by virtue of stability. At work, colleagues praised my composure under pressure, my ability to manage complex situations without visible strain, and these affirmations echoed the feedback I received at home, reinforcing a single narrative about who I was: reliable, steady, unflappable, and while this consistency should perhaps have prompted reflection, it instead provided reassurance, because coherence across environments felt like authenticity rather than confinement. I liked knowing who I was in the eyes of others, and I did not yet question whether that identity left room for change. There were evenings when I returned home feeling inexplicably drained despite having done nothing outwardly strenuous, a fatigue that did not correspond to physical exertion or emotional turmoil, and I attributed it to the normal demands of adulthood rather than to any specific source. I rested, recharged, and resumed, trusting that energy ebbs and flows naturally, and I did not pause long enough to consider whether the direction of that flow had begun to favor others more consistently than myself. The family continued to function smoothly, outwardly harmonious, and if there were undercurrents of tension, they were subtle enough to be managed through patience and conversation, skills I possessed in abundance, and so I remained confident that my approach was effective. I believed that my calm contributed to this stability, that my willingness to adapt prevented unnecessary conflict, and this belief sustained me even as my role became more defined and less flexible than I realized. No one asked me directly to carry more, and that absence of explicit demand made it difficult to articulate what was changing, because expectation is easier to confront when it is spoken, and here it existed only in patterns, in rhythms that adjusted around my presence without acknowledging the adjustment. I continued to move within these rhythms gracefully, telling myself that this was what it meant to be part of something larger than oneself, to prioritize collective ease over individual assertion. If someone had asked me then whether anything felt wrong, I would have struggled to answer honestly, because wrongness had not yet announced itself in any clear way, and discomfort, when it appeared, was fleeting and easily rationalized. I still felt loved, still felt included, still felt seen, and these feelings carried enough weight to overshadow the quiet sense that my life was becoming increasingly organized around maintaining equilibrium rather than pursuing expansion. What I did not yet understand was that systems built on unspoken roles rarely signal strain until those roles are questioned, and at that point, questioning itself becomes the disruption. I was not questioning yet, not consciously, not deliberately, and so everything continued to appear normal, even affectionate, even functional, as my calm settled more firmly into place, no longer just a personal trait but a structural element of our family's dynamic, supporting weight I had not realized I was carrying, because it had been added gradually, one reasonable adjustment at a time. The moment I began to see it was not dramatic, which is perhaps why it stayed with me so clearly, because realizations that arrive quietly tend to lodge themselves deeper than those announced by conflict, and this one settled in during an ordinary afternoon when nothing was wrong and no one was upset. I was sitting alone, reviewing plans that had accumulated without my noticing, obligations layered neatly on top of one another, each justified, each reasonable, and for the first time I felt a distinct separation between what I was doing and what I had chosen, a thin but undeniable line that altered how I understood everything that had come before. It was not a single request or expectation that caused this shift, but a pattern that revealed itself when I paused long enough to observe it without the usual urgency to resolve or accommodate, and in that pause, I saw how naturally decisions bent around my flexibility, how my consent was implied rather than sought, and how my presence functioned less as participation and more as infrastructure. The clarity was unsettling not because it exposed malice, but because it exposed normalcy, a system operating smoothly on assumptions no one had articulated because they benefited everyone involved. I noticed how often conversations concluded with my agreement rather than my preference, how plans solidified once I confirmed availability rather than before, and how my siblings' schedules were treated as fixed while mine remained negotiable, not through coercion but through habit. This observation did not ignite anger, at least not immediately, because anger requires a sense of violation, and what I felt instead was recognition, a quiet understanding that something had been happening consistently without my naming it, and that my silence had been interpreted as endorsement. When I replayed recent interactions in my mind, I heard the language more clearly, phrases that framed reliance as appreciation and expectation as trust, and I realized how often I had responded affirmatively without fully considering alternatives, because the alternative, introducing friction, felt disproportionate to the request. I had become efficient at minimizing disruption, so efficient that I rarely allowed myself to experience the discomfort of saying no, and that efficiency had trained others to depend on it without realizing what it required. This realization did not arrive with blame attached, and that was perhaps the most destabilizing part, because it left me without a clear target for resentment, forcing me to confront my own role in maintaining the dynamic. I had participated willingly, even enthusiastically, in being the person who smoothed and stabilized, and acknowledging this did not diminish the imbalance, but it complicated it, because it meant that responsibility was shared in ways that were difficult to separate neatly. I began paying attention differently, listening not just to what was said but to what was assumed, and in doing so, I noticed how rarely my own needs entered the conversation unless I introduced them deliberately, and how seldom I did so. It was not that my family dismissed me outright, but that the structure of our interactions did not make space for spontaneity from me. Because spontaneity disrupts predictability, and predictability had become the cornerstone of our collective ease. There were moments when I tested this awareness quietly, not by refusing outright but by delaying responses, by allowing questions to linger rather than answering them immediately, and the reactions were subtle but telling: a slight increase in urgency, a gentle reminder framed as concern, a comment about how things worked better when I handled them. These responses were not aggressive, but they revealed dependence more clearly than any demand could have, and they confirmed what I had begun to suspect, that my calm had become a resource others relied on rather than a personal choice. Internally, something shifted in how I related to my own composure, and what I had once seen as an inherent trait began to feel like a skill I had been deploying continuously, often without rest. I recognized how much cognitive and emotional energy it took to remain steady in every situation, to absorb tension without transmitting it, and to translate between perspectives without asserting my own, and this recognition brought with it a fatigue that felt more honest than the vague tiredness I had previously dismissed. I found myself questioning small things that I had never questioned before: why I felt responsible for ensuring everyone's comfort, why conflict felt like a personal failure rather than a shared challenge, and why my worth within the family seemed so closely tied to my ability to remain unruffled. These questions did not yet demand answers, but they created space for possibility, for imagining what it might feel like to exist within the family without constantly regulating its emotional temperature. Despite this internal shift, my external behavior remained largely unchanged, because awareness does not immediately translate into action, and I was still deeply invested in the relationships that defined my life. I continued to show up, to contribute, to support, but with a new attentiveness that altered the texture of my experience, and I noticed how often I felt a quiet resistance when I agreed to things automatically, a subtle hesitation that signaled the presence of choice where I had previously perceived inevitability. The most unsettling aspect of this period was the realization that nothing would force change unless I initiated it, because the system was functioning effectively from everyone else's perspective, and effective systems resist alteration by design. There was no crisis to justify intervention, no overt injustice to rally around, only a growing sense that my interior life was narrowing in service of maintaining a structure that did not recognize the cost of its stability. I did not share these thoughts with anyone, not out of secrecy but out of uncertainty, because articulating them would have required clarity I did not yet possess, and I was wary of framing something so complex in a way that could be misunderstood as accusation. I needed time to understand my own perspective before inviting others into it, and so I kept these observations private, allowing them to reshape my understanding quietly rather than disrupt relationships prematurely. As days passed, this awareness became less of a revelation and more of a lens through which I viewed familiar interactions, and once that lens settled into place, it altered everything without changing anything, because the actions remained the same while the interpretation shifted. I could no longer unsee how often my flexibility was treated as infinite, how rarely anyone checked whether it was still available, and how easily my calm was woven into the fabric of our family's functioning without acknowledgement of its limits. This was not yet the beginning of confrontation or withdrawal, but it was the end of unconscious participation, and that distinction mattered, because once a pattern is recognized, it cannot return to innocence. I remained present, engaged, and outwardly composed, but internally, I had stepped back just enough to observe rather than absorb, to notice rather than neutralize, and in that subtle shift, the foundation of everything I thought I understood about my role began to loosen, preparing the ground for changes that would not announce themselves loudly, but would nonetheless alter the balance irrevocably. I did not wake up one morning determined to change anything, because decisive moments are rarely as clean as stories suggest, and what happened instead was a gradual reorientation that expressed itself through restraint rather than action. Having recognized the pattern, I became deliberate in ways that were nearly invisible, choosing not to rush toward resolution, not to preemptively smooth edges, and not to volunteer myself as the solution before a problem fully existed. This was not defiance, and it was not strategy, but a quiet decision to let moments unfold without immediately inserting my calm as a stabilizing force. The first differences appeared in conversation, Subtle pauses where I allowed questions to remain unanswered for a breath longer than usual, responses that acknowledged uncertainty rather than resolving it, and a growing willingness to say that I needed time to think before committing to anything. These adjustments felt almost imperceptible from the outside, yet internally they required significant effort, because I was unlearning habits that had long defined my sense of usefulness, and in their absence, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease, as though I were occupying a space that had previously been reserved for others. Reactions emerged quietly, not as objections but as recalibrations, gentle nudges that sought to restore familiar rhythms, comments framed as concern for my well-being that nonetheless carried an expectation of availability, and reminders of how smoothly things ran when I was fully engaged. I listened carefully, noting the emotional texture of these interactions, the way reassurance was requested rather than offered, and how often my composure was invoked as a solution without explicit acknowledgement of the work it required. As I stepped back from automatically managing dynamics, I began to notice tensions that had previously been diffused before they could surface, disagreements between my siblings that lingered longer than usual, moments of impatience between my parents that were not immediately resolved, and logistical oversights that created mild frustration rather than seamless outcomes. None of these developments were catastrophic, but they disrupted the illusion of effortless harmony, revealing that what we had called stability was in fact a balance maintained through constant, quiet adjustment. I resisted the impulse to intervene, not because I wanted things to unravel, but because I needed to see whether they would resolve themselves without my involvement, and this restraint felt both unnatural and necessary, like holding back a reflex. In doing so, I became acutely aware of how often I had previously acted to spare others discomfort, and how rarely that same consideration had been extended to me, not out of disregard, but because my discomfort had been rendered invisible through habit. There were moments when my parents expressed confusion, asking whether something was wrong, noting that I seemed distracted or distant, and I reassured them honestly without over-explaining, because my internal shift did not yet require external validation. I told them I was fine, which was true, though fine no longer meant fully available, and this distinction, while subtle, marked a significant departure from my previous posture, because it asserted that my well-being was not synonymous with my utility. My siblings reacted differently, one growing more insistent in their requests, another becoming more withdrawn, and I observed these responses without judgment, recognizing them as attempts to adapt to a change they did not yet understand. I noticed how quickly frustration surfaced when I did not immediately accommodate, how easily my absence from certain roles created anxiety, and how these reactions revealed the extent to which my presence had functioned as a stabilizing constant rather than a collaborative element. Internally, I grappled with guilt, not because I believed I was doing something wrong, but because I was disrupting a system that had rewarded me with belonging and approval, and stepping outside of that system felt like a risk to relationships I valued deeply. I questioned whether my restraint was selfish, whether my need for space justified the discomfort it caused, and whether I was overinterpreting dynamics that others experienced as benign, and these doubts accompanied me constantly, reminding me that change, even when necessary, rarely feels virtuous in the moment. Despite these uncertainties, I continued to hold back, allowing responsibilities to redistribute themselves unevenly, allowing conversations to conclude without tidy resolutions, and allowing others to experience the consequences of ambiguity without rushing to clarify or soothe. In doing so, I gained insight into how dependent the family had become on my mediation, and how ill-prepared they were to navigate tension without it, not because they lacked capacity, but because they had not needed to exercise it while I was there to absorb the strain. This period revealed dynamics that had previously been obscured by my involvement, patterns of avoidance, unspoken resentments, and competing priorities that surfaced once my calming influence receded, and witnessing these dynamics unfold was both validating and painful, because it confirmed that my role had been more central than acknowledged, while also demonstrating the fragility of a harmony that required my constant participation. I did not confront anyone during this time, because confrontation would have shifted focus toward justification rather than understanding, and I wanted clarity more than vindication. I needed to see the family as it functioned without my continuous regulation, to understand whether my presence had been additive or essential, and the answer became increasingly clear as tensions persisted and attempts to restore the previous equilibrium intensified. The more I maintained my boundaries quietly, the more others seemed to reach for the version of me they were accustomed to, invoking shared history, affection, and even humor to coax me back into familiar patterns, and I responded with warmth but firmness, unwilling to surrender the space I had created simply to alleviate discomfort. This balance was difficult to maintain, because I did not want to withdraw emotionally, only functionally, and separating the two required constant attention and restraint. Through this process, I began to experience a sense of self that was not entirely defined by my role within the family, moments of clarity where I recognized my own desires without immediately subordinating them, and these moments, though brief, were enough to sustain me through the discomfort of transition. I realized that calm, when chosen, could be a powerful boundary rather than a concession, and that withholding it was not an act of aggression but an assertion of presence. By the end of this phase, the family dynamic had shifted noticeably, though no one had named it directly, and the absence of explicit acknowledgement made the tension feel unresolved yet unmistakable. The system was adjusting, straining, testing its limits, and while I remained outwardly composed, internally I understood that there was no returning to the previous state of unconscious balance, because once calm is reclaimed as a choice rather than an obligation, its withdrawal reveals the true shape of what it had been holding together. The conversation that ended everything did not begin as a confrontation, and that was fitting, because nothing about what followed required raised voices or dramatic declarations to be irreversible. We were together for an ordinary reason, a routine gathering that would once have unfolded smoothly under my quiet management, and I noticed immediately how tentative the atmosphere felt without my guidance, how conversations stalled and resumed awkwardly, how glances lingered on me as though waiting for an invisible cue that never came. I remained present, attentive, and calm, but I did not step in to shape the moment, and that absence, more than any accusation, made the tension undeniable. It was my mother who spoke first, her tone careful, almost gentle, asking whether I was upset about something, whether she had missed a change in me that needed addressing, and in that question I heard not guilt but genuine confusion, the sound of someone realizing that a familiar structure no longer behaved as expected. I looked at her and felt no anger, only a clarity that had taken months to solidify, and I understood that this was the moment when silence would no longer serve either of us. I told them the truth without embellishment, not as an indictment but as an explanation, because explanations, when honest, do not require defensiveness. I said that nothing had happened recently, that there was no single incident to point to, and that was perhaps the most unsettling part for them, because it removed the possibility of resolution through apology or correction. I explained that over time I had come to realize how much of the family's stability rested on my willingness to adjust constantly, to absorb tension quietly, and to prioritize ease over expression, and that while I had once believed this was simply who I was, I now understood it as a role I had been playing without fully consenting to its permanence. They listened, though not without discomfort, and I could see them searching for familiar cues, for reassurance that this conversation would end with restoration rather than recalibration. My siblings shifted in their seats, expressions moving between defensiveness and recognition, and I recognized in their reactions the same uncertainty I had felt when I first saw the pattern clearly, the disorientation that comes from realizing that something you relied on was not an unchangeable fact but a choice someone else had been making on your behalf. I continued, careful not to frame myself as a victim, because victimhood would have invited dismissal, and I was not interested in absolution. I told them that my calm had never been strength alone, that it had also been avoidance, a way of maintaining belonging by minimizing my own needs, and that while I did not blame them for benefiting from this dynamic, I could no longer participate in it without erasing parts of myself. This admission was my darkest secret, not because it implicated them, but because it implicated me, revealing that my silence had been as much about fear as generosity. The room grew quiet in a way that felt different from previous silences, heavier, more reflective, and in that stillness I sensed a shift that could not be undone. My parents responded with a mix of regret and confusion, acknowledging that they had relied on me without realizing the cost, and my siblings reacted more unevenly, one expressing understanding tinged with guilt, another struggling to accept a version of events that disrupted their sense of fairness. I allowed these reactions to exist without smoothing them over, recognizing that discomfort was not something I needed to resolve for them anymore. What followed was not reconciliation in the way stories often promise, but redefinition, conversations that clarified boundaries rather than restoring familiarity, agreements that acknowledged limits rather than assuming flexibility, and an acceptance, gradual and imperfect, that the family we had been could not continue unchanged. Some connections grew quieter, others more honest, and a few carried a distance that neither side attempted to close, because closeness, I had learned, is only meaningful when it does not require self-erasure. In the weeks that followed, I felt a mixture of grief and relief, mourning the loss of a role that had once given me purpose while embracing the space it left behind, and this emotional complexity reassured me that I had not acted out of bitterness but out of necessity. I noticed how my energy returned in unexpected ways, how decisions felt lighter when they were mine alone, and how my calm, now chosen rather than demanded, carried a different weight, one that did not invite reliance by default. My family adapted, unevenly and imperfectly, as families do when confronted with change that cannot be negotiated away, and while some dynamics softened with time, others remained altered permanently, a reminder that systems do not revert once their foundations are exposed. I no longer filled every silence or bridged every gap, and in relinquishing that responsibility, I discovered a quieter, more grounded sense of self that did not depend on being indispensable. The revenge, if it can be called that, was never about punishment, but about withdrawal, about reclaiming the parts of myself that had been quietly allocated to others under the guise of harmony. They mistook my calm for weakness, not because they intended to diminish me, but because I had allowed it to be used as a resource rather than respected as a boundary, and once that boundary was drawn, the family was forced to confront the reality of their own interdependence without my mediation. I live differently now, with fewer obligations and clearer choices, and when I think of my family, I do so without resentment, understanding that love does not guarantee fairness and that stability built on silence is only peaceful for those who are not doing the silencing. The story does not end with perfect understanding or restored balance, but with something more honest, an equilibrium that acknowledges limits, respects autonomy, and leaves no ambiguity about where I stand. I am still calm, but my calm belongs to me now, and that, more than anything I could have said or done, changed everything in a way that cannot be reversed, because once you stop being the quiet center that holds others steady, you reveal not only their dependence, but your own strength, and that revelation, once made, is final.